Prego. Si sente? Sentite a casa? Se può sapere. Chissà. Allora. So this is the topic. It's, I don't know if you remember when the whole COVID thing started. Here I just went back on Twitter and I found an old sequence of tweets with colleagues on Twitter. This was March 24th, 2020. And together with the pandemic, with the urgency, with the you know, what's going on, the world is coming apart and so forth, there was another sense of urgency among academics, which was basically realizing how incredible the moment was for studying, for instance, metaphors, right? Because it was an unprecedented situation. It was a situation where, you know, there was this invisible enemy, there was this situation that we all didn't know much about. So it was new, dangerous, and so forth. So a lot of people, a lot of linguists and academics thought, there is going to be a very good, you know, it's going to be interesting to analyze the discourse, like what people say, how people talk about these new things, right? And so even on Twitter, immediately there was this like, let's see what metaphors people use to talk about COVID. And we should collect metaphors, we should collect data from different countries in different languages. And immediately this hashtag Reframe COVID gained popularity, because very soon during the pandemic, people realized that it could be the case that the famous military metaphors, the war metaphors that have been used many times to talk about diseases, wars against crime, wars against different situations, could be also used to talk about the war against COVID. And so it became immediately clear that we had to collect data. We had to look at what type of metaphors were going to be used and so forth. And a lot of colleagues started to put together this spreadsheet in which they collected alternative metaphors to talk about COVID-related issues that were not the war frame, let's say, within the war frame. And looking at this endeavor, which I think is incredibly useful and everything, but I took one step back and I thought, okay, but we are assuming that military metaphors are pervasive, are used everywhere to talk about COVID, but nobody actually measured to what extent are we using military metaphors. So I looked very quickly at some literature, and I only found, back in 2020, I only found this study, Karlberg and Buell, from 2005, in which they analyzed articles in the Time magazine, for instance, in a longitudinal way, and they found, so on a large scale, and they found that 17% of the articles published between 1981 and 2000 contained one war metaphor. So, and I thought, okay, 17% of all articles containing war military metaphors, it's you know, it's a good amount of articles. How does the COVID discourse compare to this? Are we using like a lot of military metaphors also to talk about COVID? Up to 17% of our communications, let's say. And then, okay, I started to put together some theoretical, let's say, pieces. And I realized together with my colleague who then joined me in these studies, which is Philip Vicke. I'm going to present him briefly later. We realized that in public discourse is often analyzed in relation to different frames or framings. What is a frame? Usually it's in communication sciences, is defined as a selection of some aspects of a perceived reality, which taken together make a standpoint from which a topic can be seen. So when we frame a topic, when we frame a discourse in a particular way, we select some aspects and we present the topic through the lens, let's say, of this frame. And usually such frames, such standpoints are used to promote a problem definition or a causal interpretation, a moral evaluations, and so forth. Within this definition of framing, metaphors can be used to establish a perspective on a given topic. So we can use a figurative frame, so a series of metaphors that together construct a figurative frame, and we talk about a specific topic using this, from this standpoint somehow. So the war frame, let's say, is the standpoint that we may take to talk about COVID, and therefore we may use military metaphors in language because we have this military frame, this war frame. Okay, so what we did is we were interested in looking at social media, and in particular on Twitter, because it's particularly easy compared to other social media to collect large samples of tweets and then analyze them automatically. We focused on Twitter, and we wanted to answer to two sets of questions because these were two different studies. In a first study, we wanted to look at the topics, like when people talk about COVID, what do they actually talk about? They talk about, I don't know, relationships with their family members that are more difficult. Do they talk about politics and COVID? Do they talk about, what do they talk about? What happens in the hospitals? And then we wanted to see what type of lexical entries, what type of words are related to the military domain are used in these tweets, which arguably are going to be used metaphorically, because if we talk about a war against an invisible enemy, it's going to be metaphorical. And then we wanted to see how this military frame, how this war frame, and therefore these military metaphors compare to other possible frames that we may use to talk about COVID. And in particular, some of the frames that had been, the figurative frames that had been identified by the Reframe COVID initiative. Somebody suggested that COVID was also discussed in terms of a tsunami or a storm or even a monster. So we wanted to see, on a measure quantitatively, to what extent we use the war frame, to what extent we use alternative figurative frames, or even a literal frame. So this was the first round of questions. And then in the second round of questions, we took more of a longitudinal approach, and we wanted to see how the discourse, how the metaphors and the discourse about COVID in Twitter changed through time. And we focused actually on 100 days, starting from March until the summer of 2020. Because back then, I don't know if you remember, but then we thought, okay, but then in the summer 2020, the vaccines come, and then we will be all free. We had no idea that there will be another year of, so we thought, okay, let's do this longitudinally until summer 2020, and then in the fall we will be all done with this. It actually didn't go that way, but anyway. So we looked at some literature to start with, and we realized very quickly that Twitter was a gold mine, let's say, to investigate how epidemics and pandemics spread, and to track actually epidemics and pandemics. And before COVID, there had been some other epidemics in the years before, and there were studies that analyzed the discourse about the Zika, Ebola, measles, the dengue fever, and how it spread in South America or in Africa, even in the United States. And actually, in some studies, they showed that they were able, by tracking where people tweeted about these diseases, they were able to predict where the pandemic was going somehow. So they were able to follow the spreading of the pandemic. So that was very interesting. But there were not many studies actually about figurative framing and the use of metaphors within the discourse about pandemics. So here we also had our eyes on the press and on how military metaphors were treated or acknowledged in some journals, in some newspapers. And here you can see that indeed there seemed to be the resistance toward the military metaphors was quickly building up. Right? Trump is not a wartime president and COVID is not a war. Military metaphors distort the reality, lay off those war metaphors, world leaders, you could be the next casualty. So there was a sort of a resistance against these military metaphors. But again, nobody actually had measured to what extent these metaphors were pervasive and used by people also, not just in the press. So what we did, our first study, we addressed this question. What type of topics are discussed on Twitter, first of all? To what extent is the war figurative frame used to talk about COVID on Twitter? And which words specifically within the military semantic field, which words are used to talk about COVID? And how does this frame compares to alternative figurative frames? So we collected a corpus of more than 200,000 tweets, sampled day by day for a span of 10 days in English. And we collected tweets that had one of these hashtags, so COVID-19, coronavirus, and so forth. So all of the tweets that we collected had hashtag something related to COVID. We filtered one tweet per user to possibly limit the damage that bots could have introduced. And also we avoided retweets because that's the same tweet, repeated many times. And by looking at this corpus of 203,000 tweets, we could see that there were the most commonly used words within these tweets were these, in general words, not war related, not military words, just in general, these were the most common words. So people, us, help, please, home, need, time, and so forth. Then we applied topic modeling, which is a computational technique. I'm not going to get into detail in this, but it's basically a way to, given a number of tweets or of documents, it's a way to extract topics, really, of discussion, topics within the discourse in the form of words that tend to appear together. So each topic in the topic modeling method, it's basically a cluster of words. Okay, and so this is the topic number 1, topic number 2, topic number 3, topic number 4, and what you get basically is the list of words within the topic. The topics are not labeled, they don't have a name, so you have to interpret the topic and understand what is that topic about. And with these 4 clusters of words, these 4 topics, we label them as basically communications and reporting, community and social compassion, politics, and how we react to the epidemic. So these seem to be the 4 main topics that people talk about on Twitter in relation with COVID. So they talk about how COVID in the press, in the journals, COVID in the community, basically family relationships affected, COVID and politics, and how we should, the measures that we should take to react to the epidemic. So stay at home, vaccinate, and so forth. Then we wanted to see within these 4 topics, where are the military metaphors? In which area of discourse, in which topic we use these military metaphors, and how can we do it automatically? So we collected from a thesaurus a list of words related to war, and from different actually thesaura. And so for instance, here we have war, and the related words are all of these: allies, armed, soldiers, riot, and so forth, weapon, and so forth. And then basically we looked at all of these words within the war domain, and we looked at our corpus automatically and checked which words were used in these tweets and how much, yeah. And then we looked at in which topics they were actually used. And we found that the most commonly used words within the war domain are fight, fighting, war, combat, threat, battle, front line, military, and so forth. These are in order of frequency, basically. In particular, the first words are the most frequent words in the tweets about COVID. And then there are words that are related to war, but they are not used at all to talk about COVID, like guerrilla or blitzkrieg. We didn't use those. Then we did the same with other figurative frames taken from the Reframe COVID initiative. And so we looked at the frame of the storm, COVID as a storm, COVID as a monster, COVID as a tsunami. And we took a literal frame. Remember that a frame is defined as an aspect through which we present a topic. And so the literal frame has to be a part of the general topic, and we choose the family, because actually a lot of people were, many families were affected in different ways by this pandemic. So as a literal frame, we picked the standpoint of the literal frame of family. And so we again collected all of the words within these frames, and we checked to what extent they are used in our corpus. And as you can see, the percentage of tweets in the whole corpus of 200,000 tweets where we have war-related terms is 5.25%. So it's rather far from the 17% argued by those people that studied the articles on the Time newspaper. But it's much higher than alternative figurative frames. So the storm, talking about COVID as a storm, 1.49, as a monster, 0.68, so 5.25 is much higher. The control condition, let's say, of the literal frame of family, though, is much higher. So we also replicated the study, let's see if I have, no, on a larger corpus, on a different corpus of tweet that other scholars in the meantime, the reviewer probably, in the meantime had put together. We replicated our studies and it didn't change much. So between actually 5.3% and 6.9% of all the tweets in our corpus contained at least one military term. Tweets about COVID. And then in which topics, we had these 4 topics, and we found out that basically in those tweets that discussed issues about COVID, issues about communications and reporting, and issues about how we should react to the pandemic. So those topics were the topics where we could find most of the military metaphors. While, of course, tweets about COVID, but that talked about community and social compassion, let's stay together and so forth, they didn't have much military metaphors, of course, as expected. So to summarize this first part of the study, yeah, we found that, yeah, military metaphors are more common than other figurative frames, but they're not as pervasive as many people claim they are. And then in the second round of studies, the one that I said, it was more of a longitudinal study. We wanted to see how the use of military terms changed through time. We first looked at actually, yeah, how topics, sentiments, subjectivities, and figurative frames change over time in the discourse about COVID in Twitter. About topics, how topics change over time, we had this hypothesis. So the pandemic is in constant development and change. So we hypothesized that also the topics of discussion on Twitter, people that talk about COVID on Twitter would focus on different aspects of the pandemic on Twitter, and they would switch focus as the pandemic developed. Our hypothesis about the sentiments of the people, so we ran also a sentiment analysis on our corpus of tweets. We thought that because of the number of cases that was increasing steadily, actually, we thought that this increasing number of patients and of deaths would correlate with negative feelings that could emerge from the tweets, and vice versa. When the numbers decrease, we expected to see maybe more positive feelings. Also, there is another measure, another metrics we were interested in, is called subjectivity. This is a metrics that can differentiate basically between fact-oriented, data-oriented tweets, which contain words that are objective, that are factual, that are neutral from the point of view of the sentiments, and opinion-oriented tweets, which are tweets that contain words loaded with opinions, with emotions, they're more opinion-based, and so they're loaded with emotions rather than neutral. So we looked at how this subjectivity changed through time, and then how the framings changed through time. I'm gonna skip again the technical aspects. And so I have also QR codes, but I also can share the paper directly because the analysis is not super intuitive, maybe. In topic modeling, what you can do, basically, you can set the number of topics that you want your data to be divided into. So you can say to the algorithm, divide my corpus into 10 topics of discussion. Divide my corpus into 64 topics of discussion. And the algorithms goes and makes all the clusters of related words. So we did different types of analysis. We analyzed the corpus of tweets into 12 topics, into 20 topics, and I'm going to explain it, 32 topics, and then we had a super granular analysis of 64 topics, okay? And what we did, let's go back, what we did is that for each topic, here we can see the number of tweets that are in that topic. These are the topics, these colors here. So each stripe is a topic, and here you have the number of tweets within that topic. So basically, the more the stripe is wide, the more there are tweets about that topic. And so whenever we saw a widening in the stripe, we realized that people were talking a lot about that topic. And so we tried to match that with the news. Like, what happened those days? Why are people talking a lot about Trump and China in these dates here, for instance? That's because Trump went to China and so forth. So we tried to match the news with the density of the tweets within a given topic. And we found interesting trends. We observed interesting trends. For instance, because I don't have the time to explain all of them, there was this terrible event, this murder of African-American citizen George Floyd by a police officer on the 25th of May, 2020. That didn't correspond to a peak of cases in India, no. But there was a topic, let's see now, is it this? Lives, pandemic, police. And as you can see, around the end of May, there is a corresponding increase in the density of tweets here within the topic labeled as lives, pandemic, police. So it can be so people who were tweeting about COVID issues were tweeting the opposite maybe. People who were tweeting about the George Floyd event were also relating it to COVID. So we're also using the COVID hashtag because in our corpus we had only tweets with COVID hashtags. So this, we thought that it was very, very interesting. How about the sentiments? How the sentiments, polarity, so positive feelings, negative feelings, change through time. We saw a pretty clear parabola. So the more it goes up, the more the sentiment is positive. So you can see there are days where people were very depressed and days where people were kind of more positive. But the trend, the overall trend, is not very positive. So there was, so this is day 50, so it's March, the end of the spring, maybe because there was these openings, the lockdowns were done. So the openings, we thought it would be over, but then, and then the summer comes, but then actually the cases start to rise again. And so the sentiment goes down again. And here we have a couple of examples of how the polarity of the tweets changes through time. This is a tweet with positive polarity from March 2020, probably for the best. Don't need everyone's grubby hands digging in them, spreading coronavirus around. Bright side. And in July, this is an example of a tweet with a negative polarity. Bullshit, our country is the worst in the world for the pandemic because of you, not China. Stop blaming everyone else and trying to deflect blame. The state of our country is your fault and yours alone. Resign. I guess this was addressed to Trump. Of course, those of you who do or are familiar with sentiment analysis know that a lexicon-based sentiment analysis has the problem of not being able to detect sarcasm, for instance, which is an open issue in sentiment analysis. So a tweet that has positive words used sarcastically is labeled as a positive feelings tweet, while we humans know that indeed is a sarcastic. So this has to be taken with caution. The subjectivity of the tweets, if you remember that difference between fact-based tweets and opinion-based tweets, is also not very good. We get increasingly more emotional and increasingly more detached from neutral language and facts and more toward like my personal opinion. And so the tweets are loaded with emotional words, positive or negative, you know, all together, but emotions rather than facts. And here again, this is an example of a rather factual tweet. So objective tweet from early March. Things Corona has done to us, made us wash our hands, canceled allergy season, coughing and sneezing. Otherwise, people think we are possessed. And July, this is an example of a tweet that it's more opinion-based, more subjective. Maybe being stupid is a pre-existing condition that makes you susceptible to the coronavirus. So these are just 2 examples. And the very last thing, I lost track of time. I think I have 2 minutes, yeah? The very last thing, how these figurative frames and the war figurative frames changed through time. If you remember, there were some words like fight, fighting. There were words that were particularly common in the discourse on Twitter, we used metaphorically. And so we looked at how military terms were used through time, and we could see that in the beginning of the pandemic, so March, April, indeed, there was that 5–6% of tweets containing military words. So it was pretty common, even though not so much. But then it seemed to decrease. So war-related terms lost their frequency, their appeal, let's say. It's not an appeal, but lost frequency, were used less frequently. And this is for each of the most commonly used war-related terms: fight, fighting, war, attack. You can see that all of them, attack had maybe an increase again here in June, but overall they tend to, the military terms tend to be used less. Within the war frame, however, there were military terms that were not used in the beginning of the pandemic, but they became very much used at some point. No? And these are words like riot, violence, military, and soldiers. And we realized that these terms within the domain of military terms, in this period in time, they were not used metaphorically. They were used in their literal sense, because this was the time where the Black Lives Matter movement became extremely, I don't want to say popular, gained momentum. And so these war-related terms were not used metaphorically to talk about COVID, but they were used in their literal sense. And we think that it could also be the case that because actual, literal riots were in the streets, then it could be the case that the metaphorical, the military terms used metaphorically didn't feel right anymore because there were actual, literal riots in the street. So I would actually predict that nowadays, with the war that we have in Ukraine, even more military terms would feel wrong to talk about COVID because there is actual war. So to conclude, yeah, with this study, we wanted to try to measure actually the pervasiveness of this war metaphor to talk about COVID on Twitter. So we took this quantitative, still explorative approach to discourse. And we believe that this has to be integrated with qualitative analysis that are more fine-grained on specific examples and so forth. But they have to go hand in hand. They have to go together. And so interdisciplinary collaborations, we think, are crucial for this. In this study, we adopted different methods: topic modeling, sentiment analysis, and discourse analysis. And we think that together these methods can actually help us to shed light on discourse dynamic. And sometimes, yeah, operationalizing notions like figurative frame into measurable variables is a delicate and not error-free step, so, but it is necessary in order to have a more quantitative approach. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianna, for this insightful plenary. I guess there are many questions or comments. Please.
Scusa, la faccio in italiano, poi magari traducete. No, a proposito della percentuale di utilizzo della metafora, mi domandavo se non fosse comunque influenzata dal tipo nel senso le statistiche precedenti, se non sbaglio, riguardavano dati tratti dai giornali.
The Times.
Esatto.
Sì, sì.
Ora, secondo me, chi di più ha usato la metafora della guerra sono stati i politici.
Sì.
Chiaro, i giornalisti che
politici,
riprendono le parole della politica, perché cioè, il cittadino comune difficilmente usa la metafora della guerra, dice siamo in guerra contro il virus, cioè sono i politici che lo dicono perché devono giustificare le loro azioni, no? Quindi probabilmente se aveste fatto uno studio sui tweet dei politici o dei giornalisti, la percentuale sarebbe schizzata. È possibile?
Ah, interessante. Sì, probabilmente sì. Infatti, nei tweets del nostro corpus non abbiamo distinto effettivamente, ma abbiamo visto che le parole utilizzate più metaforicamente erano parole come fight, fighting, e quelle sono metafore molto convenzionalizzate. Combattere contro un virus, cioè sì, no? Probabilmente appunto il parlante medio non lo percepisce neanche più come una metafora, insomma, quindi. Mentre invece probabilmente politici e giornalisti sì, usano il frame della guerra, però usano anche metafore un po' più vive in un certo senso, un po' più conflittuali.
Cioè, Macron, ad esempio, aveva proprio sviluppato tutta la metafora, diceva ci sono quelli che sono
trincea.
Esattamente,
Sì,
e poi ci sono quelli che vengono dopo, eccetera, 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 quindi aveva proprio declinato tutto il concetto in maniera, però quello era un discorso finalizzato veramente
poi a mosse politiche.
Esattamente,
certo. Sì. Questo sarebbe molto interessante da fare, effettivamente.
Un piccolo chiarimento, mi riallaccio un po' a quello che ha detto Adriana. Uno immagina che in queste metafore, soprattutto se usate dai politici o in senso più negativo di opposizione alla metafora, magari anche dai giornalisti, non ci sia anche una giustificazione di una spinta all'azione, cioè dobbiamo agire in un certo modo perché. Ecco, questo voi l'avete approfondito perché mi interesserebbe particolarmente. Nel caso se hai qualcosa tu o di Elena Semino, così fammelo avere.
Ecco, va bene. Forse Elena, sì. Sì.
Is this a hand? Okay.
Dovevo rispondere in inglese? No, io ho risposto in italiano. Okay.
Grazie per la presentazione. Era una curiosità. Ci sono stati casi in cui più di un frame è stato utilizzato insieme, cioè oltre al linguaggio della guerra, anche quello che ne so, la metafora della storm,
allora,
cioè combinazioni.
Dovrei calcolarlo, vedere l'overlap, se ci sono dei tweet in overlap. Non ci abbiamo fatto caso, onestamente, non abbiamo guardato. Però può essere. Ci sono casi dove uno appunto magari inizia con un frame di guerra, poi si rende conto, cambia e invece inizia a parlare di Covid come uno tsunami. Ci sono casi di... sì.
Grazie.
Probabilmente ce n'è anche nel nostro corpus, sì. Posso andare a vedere.
Intanto grazie, molto bello, molto interessante, soprattutto la parte dell'utilizzo di tutti questi metodi di calcolo, no? Il topic modeling, la sentiment analysis, che sono spesso problematici da mettere poi in un contesto interpretativo. E mi interessava proprio una curiosità sul topic modeling. È molto difficile quel processo di interpretazione, no? Di cui tu hai parlato, cioè ci sono tutta una serie di SID, di parole, e bisogna trovarci mettere a posto i puntini, no? E volevo sapere quali erano un po' più nel dettaglio il vostro metodo, se avevate trovato delle difficoltà o delle parole che non ci entravano, che magari erano, cioè, sicuramente sì, però ecco, un po' una riflessione su questo, perché è interessante questa...
Sì, senza dubbio sì, cioè chi lavora appunto con topic modeling lo sa, che poi c'è sempre un'interpretazione, no? Noi, il modo in cui abbiamo proceduto è indipendentemente, io e il mio coautore, ci siamo visti questi cluster di parole che erano i topics, cioè le liste poi, vabbè, insomma, e ognuno di noi indipendentemente ha cercato di attaccarci un'etichetta e poi ci siamo confrontati e devo dire che le nostre interpretazioni comunque erano molto simili, avendolo fatto prima indipendentemente, quindi poi insieme si è trattato di trovare un po' la verbalizzazione di questa etichetta, però era abbastanza chiaro che c'era un topic che parlava di robe legate al reagire all'epidemia e parlavano di mettere le mascherine, flatten the curve, sai, tutte quelle cose, stai a casa, poi c'era il topic che parlava di robe politiche, cioè effettivamente emergevano in modo abbastanza evidente, nonostante ci fosse poi magari sempre qualche parola in fondo alla lista che dici ma questo tirami su, tipo, no? Dici, però vabbè, quello insomma capita.
Grazie.
Are there any other comments, questions? Ok.
Pensavo rispetto a quello che dicevi tu e al tiramisù, forse è perché a volte si usa il topic, l'hashtag trendy per far diventare il proprio tweet o il proprio post trendy e magari non dico niente sul Covid. Cioè io l'ho visto su Instagram a volte, no? Ci sono questi che mettono hashtag di continuo e non c'entra niente con quello che hanno postato.
Solo
per cui può essere un modo anche per... E allora ci sta anche il tiramisù. Grazie.
Grazie. Ok.
Okay, unfortunately, we're running out of time because I would have many questions for you, Marianna, but let us just say that, well, this plenary to me fosters the need to collaborate interdisciplinary, because listening to your presentation, I thought, what a pity we don't talk enough. Then, okay, well, I have many questions which I wrote down, so maybe... Ah, ok.
No, ditemi poi cosa devo fare, se devo stare o... Prego.
È vero.
No, non ci sono mica mani alzate. Non si vedono mani alzate da casa. Se qualcuno a casa aveva la mano alzata, la rialzi.
Ok. Ok, then...
Non lo so, boh, tu a che ora?
Era 5:30.
Allora abbiamo ancora forse 5 minuti.
C'è una pausa in mezzo.
Non lo so, dipende voi cosa devo fare.
Dobbiamo chiudere o perché abbiamo la pausa, vero? Ok. Sì.
Allora, ora alle 5:30 è previsto un laboratorio sull'estrazione di metafore dai corpora tenuto da Federica Ferrari, diciamo principalmente destinato a studenti e dottorandi, ma ovviamente aperto a tutti. Quindi comincia dalle 5:30 alle 6:30. Invece il comitato scientifico, il consiglio scientifico del CIRM invece alle 5:30 si riunisce magari nel mio studio e quindi noi non ci potremo essere, insomma, però tutti gli altri sono liberi di rimanere, tenendo presente che insomma comunque molti dei concetti, soprattutto all'inizio, saranno probabilmente a voi noti perché è pensato per gli studenti delle magistrali e dottorandi, lo dico.
Bene, sì, sì.
Scusate, ultima cosa, per la cena di stasera, ore 20, al caffè concerto in Piazza Grande, quindi sotto il Duomo, non potete sbagliare.